I thought this was timely, and if you needed to have a real-life example of an Atlas Shrugged situation, I don't know of a better one than what's going on right now in Israel. So if you're interested, really, talk about direct application. As I go through this, think about some of the characters from Atlas and how they would apply to here, to what you're going to hear about. And I won't get any amount of time to go into a lot of detail today because this is a complicated situation. But I think the things I'd like you to take away from this are, I believe that part of the problem is that Israel doesn't have a foundational philosophy. Now, it's a mixed culture, and it's got a whole bunch of different kinds of people, a lot of different kind of Jews. It has Arabs, has a few Christians. But part of the problem is that even amongst the Jewish people, which is the majority of the population, there is no central philosophy. And we'll talk about that as we get to the middle of this. And I think the other problem is that there was an agreement made early on when the country was formed in 1948 after World War II, when the UN formed it and Israel signed a Declaration of Independence. And by the way, never formed a constitution, which is of interest as well, given what's happening. But they do have a declaration. It didn't include things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but it also included a way for a group of people, a select group of society that didn't have to contribute directly to the society, but could take and be defended by the society. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So without further ado, let me dive into this. I'm going to move fairly quickly. I'm trying, there we go. Whoops. So this is, of course, the namesake of the book. And this is one of my favorite quotes. 6 months ago, my wife is Israeli, and we spend half our time in Tel Aviv and the other half in Miami. And I should say the rest of it is in the summer here in Massachusetts in Cape Cod for the better weather. But I've been there in Israel now for 2 years, and I've been watching this situation unfold. So if you remember this quote, I'll read it out quickly, and I paraphrased a little bit of it. We who hold up the world, and we are in the room. I love that answer Dr. Salzman gave to who is John Galt, right? Who is, sorry, it wasn't, it was, yes, sorry. If you saw Atlas, the giant who holds up the world on his shoulders, and the greater his efforts, the heavier the world bore down on his shoulders, what would you tell him to do? And of course, Francisco is asking this, and Hank says, I don't know. What could he do? And the answer is he could shrug. And the question that I wanted to talk about today is whether the people that are holding up Israeli society, if they want to avoid a bloodshed, if they want to avoid a bloody civil war, which is possible, then maybe they need to just shrug. And maybe the only way to get rid of the current government and to move on is to shrug. Okay. Israel quickly was born 75 years ago with a declaration without a constitution. It is a bit of a miracle of a country trying to be a democracy as much as it can, and it's thriving. It's a successful country by any measure. Beginning in the 1980s, based on innovation across many areas, they have a thriving economy and excellent educational systems throughout the country. It's in the midst of losing its democratic identity now. And it's not been covered much in the press over here. Actually, Biden's gotten involved, for once at least in my opinion, on the right side of the argument. But it's a bit being destroyed within. And in a way that's ironically and eerily similar to what happened in Atlas Shrugged, with a group of mystics and a group of muscle. The words that she uses and are certainly remarkably starting to creep into the Israeli coverage of this. And I contend that those who have built the modern Israel, those who fought in the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Forces, who have the guts to build great companies, whose brains have contributed to some of the greatest technologies, medical, military, financial, tracking, cybersecurity, etc., must again stand up for Israel and for all courageous humans. I think the lessons that are being learned there, we need to think about here as well. Because we're a big country in America. We have a lot more elasticity and flexibility to allow the kind of silliness that's going on. But there may come a time when we have people whose feelings are more important than reality, and who are busy worrying about their identity instead of how to make humanity better and more prosperous, where we may have to we may have to come up with a way to shrug or do something similar. And we ought to take that seriously. So it's nice to see this in a microcosm. I'm going to read quickly through the miracle, because of course nobody should really be up to date on what's going on or what's happening in a country of less than 10 million people in the middle of the Middle East. They are surrounded by multiple enemies. They have a couple of truces declared between Jordan and Egypt, but basically they're at war all the time with Lebanon in the north, with Syria, and of course it's all sponsored by Iran on the north, and on the southwestern border with the Gaza Strip, which is Hamas, another terrorist organization, is leading that, and trying to take over the western side of the country, the West Bank, which is Hamas is getting a stronger foothold. All of this is Iranian proxies, and these are all well-known terrorist organizations that, quote, even the Europeans agree are terrorist organizations, end quote. The population was less than 1 million in 1948 when the country formed. It's over 9 million now. It's actually one of the top 5 countries for patent filings, which is remarkable per capita. They have 91 NASDAQ companies. It's the second highest listed number of companies in a country, I believe, after the US, although China is picking up a little bit. They're the only democracy with a freely elected officials in the Middle East, and they're one of the few, if not the only country in the Middle East that recognizes women as, at least most of society in Israel recognizes women as equivalent to men. If you've ever met Israeli women, you'll know that they're much more equal than we are, and that's good because it's much safer that way. They have high literacy rates. Their global contributions across many things, many of the universities there are in the top 100. They have a lot of collaborations with the US and so on. One of the cool things they did, and maybe California could take, I know a lot of you from California could take a picture from this, they solved the water problem in Israel. Israel is in the middle of a desert. It's called the Negev. They don't have a water problem. You're allowed to take a shower for as long as you want, and you can actually water your lawn. Can you imagine? And they have the best desalination plants there. They use a lot of solar power, but they also use, God forbid, fossil fuels because that works and it keeps the place irrigated and they can actually export. So if California wants to solve its water problem, maybe they'll learn how to do it. Bill Maher made a joke about that one day, and it's great. One of the few countries with an increasing number of trees. So they are actually building back the trees, which of course is good for the climate. And they all did this without their constitution. There are 2 sets of Jews in the country. So the way it's split up is there's 9 million people. There's about approximately 7 million are Jewish. 2 million are Arab. The Arabs, to be fair, do not have completely the same rights as the Jews, and they are not allowed to be in the combat units of the army, but they are allowed to participate in the army if they want to, and some do. They're also not required to participate in the army. Every Jewish person in Israel, except for the group on the right, which I'll talk about, is required to spend 3 years if you're a man and 2 years if you're a woman in the army. And that includes combat units. And you don't get to choose where you're going to be. You get told based on test results and essentially meritocracy. And meritocracy, of course, in hopefully most militias, but certainly in the military in Israel is the critical thing. On the left, what you see is a group, and this is the classic 2.2 kids in the this would be considered the awful Tel Avivians, the elite of society. This is the higher educated people, 2 to 4 years of army service on average, many of them in the elite units, many of them in the so-called 8200, which is the people who develop software for cyber incursions, and then of course go off and found cybersecurity companies, and the people that work in the tanks, all the way down to people in the tanks, et cetera, who work on better and the people who help design Iron Dome and everything. These are entrepreneurs, innovators. They pay very high taxes. They're running, most of these people as young people are running tax rates are in the 65 to 70% total of what they get. Salaries in general in Israel are much lower than here. 100,000 US dollars is a lot of money and a lot of salary there, even in the high-tech positions. And you can't get a high-tech employee in America for under $150,000, $200,000 these days for many of this sort of mid-level high-tech folks. The salaries are nothing like it there. A lot of these live in Tel Aviv. pretty much the entire west coast of Israel, which sits on the Mediterranean, is that group. There's a growing group, and this is what happens when you subsidize people, known as the Haredi, or the ultra-Orthodox, who in 1945/48, when the country was formed, were allowed not to be conscripted into the army, and they were left alone to study the Bible, which is what they wanted to do, but they were not subsidized. Very important. In 1977, this was changed, and per kid that you had, you were subsidized. And you could have an unlimited number of children, and the more kids you had, the more subsidies you got. Now, the wives in these families typically work. The wives and husbands typically sleep in different beds, which is their business, but it's a very different kind of family relationship, and the goal is to have as many children as possible. The average is 7.7 children per family, 7.7. It's completely funded by the taxpayers of Israel. And they don't have to study STEM. In fact, there were some moves lately to try to bring STEM requirements into the schools there because, of course, the schools are subsidized, and this was recently thrown out by the new government. They don't work and they don't pay taxes. The women do work, and they also raise the children because the husbands are off studying the Bible. Only the men are allowed to study the Bible. The women are absolutely a second class of citizen, and the goal of the current government is to do that. And I believe what I'm stating are facts. If I'm not stating facts, then people should correct me. But everything I'm saying, I'm trying to state as facts. When I think about the group on the left, I think of Hank and Dagny. And when I think about the group on the right, these are people that take from society and give nothing except more study of the Bible. And frankly, no one exactly knows what the output of the study of the Bible, because you could argue the Bible's been studied a lot. Okay, so a new government comes in under Netanyahu, and they have a screwed up method of forming a government in Israel. It is what it is. You couldn't come up with a more ridiculous system. But basically, no one gets a majority, so they have to form coalitions. And Netanyahu's now been indicted for 3 or 4, and I think recently 2 more counts of criminal activity, and is in trial for that. He got in bed with whoever he thought would help get rid of these indictments against him. I think this is his motivation, but his motivation is not really important. And he got in bed with the ultra-Orthodox and the ultra-nationalist. The ultra-Orthodox are the group you just saw. The ultra-nationalist parties in Israel look a little bit like what you saw, only they carry guns. And they mostly live in the so-called West Bank or occupied territories or whatever, also called Judea. You'll hear this. And their basic thing is that Jewish people own the entire land around. All the Arabs should be removed. They also actually believe that people who are non-believers, meaning anybody who's not ultra-Orthodox or at least Orthodox, should be removed. And we have to establish a very Jewish theological group here, and we're going to shoot anybody who doesn't agree with that. And I'm not making this up. That's the ultra-nationalist party. There's a guy called, you'll see Ben Gvir. He leads that group, and you'll see the other people in the government. So Netanyahu forms a coalition of about 64 people, which include the Likud party and these ultra-nationalist party and the ultra-Orthodox parties. It's 64 out of 120 seats in the Knesset, which is their Congress. They only have one house of Congress. And laws in Israel are passed by a majority. Any law. You want to get rid of one of the basic laws from the Declaration of our Independence, you do it by 61 people out of 120. They have 64. They can do whatever they want. And they represent, quote, the majority. Okay. What has happened over time is that the Supreme Court in Israel has assumed a stronger and stronger role, and one of the key doctrines that the Supreme Court uses, you'll love this, especially coming from a reason, purpose, self-esteem background, is called the reasonableness doctrine. And the reasonableness doctrine that the Supreme Court in Israel uses is that the Congress can make any law it wants and the executive branch can make any law they want, but it has to be reasonable. For instance, you cannot take somebody who is an ultranationalist crazy with no background in finance and make him into the finance minister. That would be unreasonable. The person who's the finance minister should have some background in finance. Kind of sounds reasonable, right? And it goes on, and I'm not making this up. This is actually true. So that reasonableness law was just overturned, 64-0. There is no more reasonableness in Israel. You can do whatever you want, and Netanyahu's plan, as soon as the Knesset comes back in September, is to put in a convicted criminal who has had as part of his conviction and staying out of jail, as part of it was that he would never be in politics again. He's going to be appointed a minister in the cabinet. So it actually contravenes what he already agreed to legally, but because everything the Supreme Court did doesn't really matter anymore, and again, I'm not making this up, it's okay. And they have the votes to do it, and the majority did it, and we all know that democracy is only about majority. And we represent the will of the majority. Okay. In addition to the reasonableness law gone, and by the way, the entire opposition, which is the other 56 people, they just abstained. They actually walked out of the Knesset. And it has finally become essentially a civil war. The current government intends to extend, or has already extended, payments for ultra-Orthodox, just another 950 million shekels, which is somewhere around $300 million, has just, not a country with a big budget, has just gone to the ultra-Orthodox to continue to study the Bible and more money per kid. All the money is coming out of the taxes for everybody else. And by the way, the wives of those families don't pay taxes because those families are officially in poverty level. Therefore, there is no taxes. It's all take and no give. And these families, the Orthodox families, do not have to be in the army. The other families are expected to send their kids to the army and pay taxes. Education for ultra-Orthodox children has now, all STEM requirements are gone. The government passed that. You want to study the Bible, you study the Bible. You don't have to be employable after that. And they're going to, you probably saw this in the news here, extending settlements in the West Bank area, Judea, and this other one called Samaria, which is less important, mountainous region. And the expansion of settlements, which has just kind of gone on willy-nilly now and just kind of unrestrained, is being condemned everywhere. Now, I don't want to get into an argument about this, but when you have all these people that are supposed to be your colleagues and your friends, and you're pissing them off every day, it's a problem. Okay. Netanyahu himself is a remarkably hypocritical person, and it is despicable. In October, when he was running for election, this wonderful op-ed, and I was so proud of this. I actually took a picture of this editorial, and I don't read the New York Times just for clarity. A friend of mine sent it to me. It was really a beautiful editorial. And Netanyahu concludes from this about why Israel is a successful country. I have been privileged to live a life of purpose. Good word, right? One in which I've helped bring my vision of peace through strength for Israel into being. Having restored our independence, we won't let anyone bring an end to this miracle. That's 8 months ago. Recently, this is not Netanyahu's note, you have the exact opposite, that he is actually going to bring an end to this miracle. And I've gone through this. And then we have all the prime minister's men, obviously modeled after the Nixonian era. But you can set your favorite characters, starting with Netanyahu, in a lot of ways is like Mr. Thompson, a head of state who doesn't really amount to much of anything, because right now Netanyahu stands for nothing much of anything except for gathering a bunch of crazies around him. And I know crazies is a subjective word, and I'm a doctor, so I guess I can point to the statistic, the diagnosis from psychiatry. But you've got the guy Yariv Levin, and part of doublespeak is to use names that are the opposite of what they are. So Yariv Levin is the Minister of Justice. He's the man who has orchestrated this entire disbanding of the Supreme Court. Because the next thing you're going to do after I appoint this minister, based on the reasonableness doctrine is going away, is they're going to fire the Attorney General. Because she's the one who's actually bringing the charges against Netanyahu and also enforcing some of his previous commitments. And it will be okay because they'll vote 64 to whatever to get rid of the Attorney General. And this guy is the guy behind it, Yariv Levin, Minister of Justice, Deputy Prime Minister. If Netanyahu goes down, And I'm saying that because he just had a pacemaker put in. He did. He actually did have a pacemaker put in. Then this guy's the guy. He's even crazier. I mean, this guy is nuts, in my opinion. That's a subjective comment. Smotrich is the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Defense. This man has zero background in finance. When asked where they were going to get funding to do all the things they're doing, he said, "It will come." You know, so we'll manna from heaven if you read the Bible, but probably it's going to come from the taxpayers, and probably it means the tax rates are up 5 or 10%. He's also the Minister of Defense, which is a joke because he was never in the Defense Forces. In fact, none of the people on this slide were ever in the Defense Forces, none of these, because they're all Orthodox, which is why they're all wearing the yarmulkes. Simcha Rotman is a very smart guy, Law and Justice Committee, and you saw what kind of justice and law they're trying to put in. It is absolutely doublespeak from George Orwell's 1984. And probably the most sinister and most evil of all these people, and I'll use that term, and I mean it, is this guy Ben Gvir, who is literally now been given money to set up the National Guard in Israel. Now, nobody thought Israel needed a National Guard before, except that there are protests going on in Israel because the middle, the people that I showed you before, the ones on the left, they call themselves leftists. By any American standard, these are center to center right. They're taxpayers that served in the army. You tell me what party they're in, okay? He's going to get a new group called the National Guard, and it's going to be modeled, it is being modeled after the Iranian National Guard, in the ultimate act of irony. And the goal of this group, I would submit, is to create a theological authoritarian government, very much modeled after Iran, their arch enemy. These four guys want to do that, I would submit. And I went in some of this. I'm not going to go into details here because I think I covered most of this. And you're all welcome to get a copy. So the two futures for Israel, this is Tel Aviv on the left. There is literally more building going on in Tel Aviv than in New York City. It is nuts. Now, there's no infrastructure to support it, and they're finally putting in a subway system, which is making the chaotic traffic even more chaotic. But it's a remarkable city. You look up there and you think, wow. And these glass towers and frankly, the office buildings there are nicer than many of the ones we have in the U.S. They're just wonderful. And they have great air conditioning, which is super important, especially when you're there. Or you can have what's on the right. And I showed you pictures like this before. So where's this puck going? One of the great quotes for the young folks here. This is Wayne Gretzky. He's arguably one of the best, if not the best all time in hockey. And he always wondered where the puck was going. And I actually think I used to do this when I was thinking about patients and how they were doing, where are they headed? Where are they now, but where are they headed? That's way more important. Where are they headed? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, that there are two groups in collusion, which ironically are right out of Atlas Shrugged, using her own words, the mystics and the muscle. The goal of this government is to put rabbinical committee. I'm not making this stuff up. Rabbinical committees will take over a lot of the secular decisions in society, including whether you can be married, whether you can get a divorce, whether you're actually Jewish or not. The rabbinical guys are going to decide whether you're Jewish or not, which is really odd. And then there's going to be a bunch of people that are modeled after the Iranian Revolutionary Guards who come out as the settlers in the West Bank and just going to be in charge of shooting people. Now, since all the problems started, there have been protests. This is the other group of people. There have been peaceful protests, except that roads have been blocked. And I honestly, me of all people, have been on the roads blocking them, yelling shame, shame to the police who are sort of keeping things in order. Because I have to say, until recently, the police have been extremely mindful and extremely patient and actually doing a semi-job because they understood who was right, and I'll get to that in a minute. There have been these pro-democracy, what are called pro-democracy demonstrations in the middle of Tel Aviv, 3 times a week at night, blocking pretty much everything. 150, 200,000 people. Remember, the country's only 10 million. The groups that are involved here are the Jewish groups, which is 7 million. So 200,000 out of 7 million, that's a lot of people. That's been likened to several millions of people in the US protesting. These are all taxpayers, and most of them have fought for the army. What other country do you know of in the history of recent civilization where the taxpayers and the army folks are protesting the government? So I talk to Israelis all the time, and frankly, there's a great deal of sleep being lost, including myself, about what's going to happen to their country, because they're too small for this. This is a disaster. And the other problem is that the entire funding for the country, almost the entire funding, is coming from this group of protesters that you're seeing there. So productivity is down. I can tell you external investment in the country has gone about 90% down. Why bring up Ayn Rand? Why talk about this except for the interesting similarities with Atlas Shrugged? Well, one of the things, and my wife is, like I said, Israeli, and she and I have lots of discussions / arguments about this. One of the things about Hebrew is there are no small letters, so if you think they're always screaming at each other, you're right, but they can't help it because the whole thing is in capitals. There is nothing in Israel that I've ever come across that talked about either life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, those things that are so central to us, and I think fundamentally, obviously, to Ayn Rand. And there's nothing about purpose, reason, and self-esteem other than to say we are all one country. Now, looking at the pictures before, and I said this to my wife when I met her 13 years ago, you are not one country. You can't have a group of people that's protected and taking, and another group of people that's not only putting their kids in harm's way in the FIDF and paying taxes. That is not one country. That is a protected class who are essentially parasites, and I use that word with her, and another group that are the producers. You have the John Galt, the producers, and you have those people who are leeches on society. If you want to study the Torah, that's fine, have at it. But you still got to earn your life. They don't talk about this stuff. And I don't think there is, when I talk to the people who are the entrepreneurs, even the CEOs, in the country, and I ask them, well, don't you realize that you're the people that are leading this country? Yeah, but it's my duty. And there is this deep sense of, honestly, it is a collectivism, which might be really important the day after you form a country and you're attacked by 5 armies at once, and that's very important. But at some point, especially when you become a successful, mostly capitalistic country, you have to transition and develop I believe, some of this reason, purpose, and self-esteem. Individuals have to start to realize we're individuals. And there is a value judgment. And I can tell you, until the last month or so, this notion of value judgment in the Hebrew news has been absent. In the last month, and especially in the last week since the passage of this bill, which led to major eruptions and finally the first bloodshed at some of the protests, when the police finally came down on people because they were instructed by this guy Ben-Gvir, who's in charge of the internal security now, he was on TV saying, break bones, I want everybody in the hospital. I want the hospitals filled with the blood of the protesters. He said that. This is Israel. This isn't some backwards 2-bit country, right? Okay. I don't want to keep going because I've gone too long. One little bit. There is an 80-year-old former prime minister of Israel who's speaking up, and he's practically the only one who's really leading the opposition. And I won't read it out because I'm running out of time, but I want to move on. What are the conclusions? What should we do? How can we help? So we have an internal existential crisis and a clash of philosophies. Never mind that Iran is drooling and having a great time watching Israel implode. One of the problems they have there is they do not call A as A. They do not say what is, until recently. And even then it is with great angst and pain And my wife always says to me, you just don't have any empathy for us. I said, you don't have time for empathy. You people thought you could reason with these zealots, and you didn't call them what they are. They are crazy, militant, theocratic zealots. And you need to, you don't want to fight them with guns. I get that. So you need to shrug. Because there's no other way to perform civil disobedience except to cut off the blood. I said, you are funding, does this sound familiar? You are funding your own destruction. You are paying taxes, you are in the IDF, you're sending your kids there, and it's all just fine, and you're going to keep doing it while these people abuse you. And their slavery has only begun. It's always been slavery because they've always sucked your money and your kids from you. But it's just going to get worse. And now they're in power. And they're going to take this, just like they attempted to. The government's going to take until it all collapses. Okay. So I think the people in the middle need to wake up. What's called the left over there, but it's clearly a middle. It's time to simplify. The other problem with Jewish people in general, and I'm one so I can say it, is they love to make everything complicated. At some point, you got to say enough. A is A, one is one. This is how it's going. And I don't care what the reasons were. You can have Holocaust problems. You can have all kinds of problems and issues, and you have to respect everyone. Bullshit. You don't have to respect everyone, especially people that are stealing from you and putting your kids in harm's way and telling it's your duty. And you have to call evil evil. And it has to be called evil. And lastly, we've got to get some more of this Atlas Society over to Israel because they need help. What happened to me? Oh, whoops. Okay. So I think the people do need to shrug. I will tell you that probably the most important change that's going on there is that Israel's army reserves on about 30% of the army is essentially reserves. And in fact, the Israeli Air Force is about 40% reserves. And actually, the reserves in the Air Force are more important than the pilots because the reserves are those pilots that were the best pilots that have gone back to teaching. There has been a mass exodus of the volunteer reserves. It is shocking. And any normal government would have panicked and stopped their stupidity because the army is in not quite deep cucka yet, but they're heading real fast. But this government is full steam ahead, despite that. So I think more shrugging would be great. Sorry I ran over, thanks.
All right, we give a big round of applause for Dr. Kauffman. If you have questions, please line up for Q&A on either side, and we will pass you the mics. All right, we'll start here with Clyde.
I'd like to congratulate Michael for his amazing assumption on what's going on in Israel. I've just come back with my wife Lorraine. We were in Israel 2 weeks ago, and I have to endorse lots of the things that he had to say. However, I want to try and give you a perspective on the problems in Israel. And this is the way I see it, and having been to Israel and have been in Israel after the 6 Day War, and visiting now with what's going on in Israel, I can accept the fact that Israel has a major problem. It's an existential problem, and the future of the country is being demoralized. And the way, just to give you a perspective, Netanyahu has come from an amazing family, and he's shown over the years to be quite an amazing leader. He's articulate, he speaks English in an American accent. He's known throughout the world. However, as all politicians, in order to become elected in a coalition, and that's the way it works in Israel, he had to get the religious parties to become part of his coalition. And as all politicians all over the world, he owes a debt to the people who put him into power. And I think that's the big conflict in Israel now, because for Netanyahu to remain a prime minister of Israel, he needs the religious coalition and that group of hard right-wing politicians. He needs them to continue to be the prime minister, in the fact that he's also been indicted on a variety of minor offenses, receiving cigars and other sort of bribes. So I think the country is in a dilemma, and it's enlightening now to see that with all our backgrounds, with the capitalistic attitudes of Ayn Rand and the possibility of using our combined knowledge and values of capitalism, there may be a possible way to try and help with what's going on in Israel. That's my comment.
Thanks. Agree.
All right, do we want to take a question over here for Casey?
Right, so I actually have 3 questions. The first one is dealing with the Supreme Court, the Israeli Supreme Court. For everybody who doesn't already know me, I'm an attorney licensed in Florida and in California. And so when it comes to the Supreme Court, right, there's this idea of the reasonableness test, right? When you're thinking of the Israeli Supreme Court, it's not, I know you already know this, but maybe everybody else doesn't.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
But with the Israeli Supreme Court, it's not like our Supreme Court here, where you've got a nomination and then, the Senate confirms and the person is placed. And, if someone dies or retires, whoever the current sitting president is gets to nominate someone else, and you go through the process. In Israel, the Supreme Court judges or justices actually decide who their successors will be, right? And so essentially you have a dynasty, and for however many years now, that's been ran by what I call ideologically aligned with the left, right? And so essentially it's like a dynasty where they get to continuously ad infinitum select who's coming up next. And then that group inside of the Supreme Court then gets to overrule, using the reasonableness test, pretty much anything, if not literally anything, that the legislature enacts, right? And so the legislature, like was spoken in the presentation earlier, elected by the people, right? But then you got this separate body that is unaccountable to the people that can overrule anything.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I was just laying that groundwork really quickly. So with that being said, in the reasonableness test, would you agree that the reasonableness test had largely become in Israel a means of saying we don't like this, therefore we're striking it down?
Yeah, look, I think that what maybe the bigger question is, does the Israeli justice system need a revamp? I think almost everybody that I've talked to in Israel, I don't remember anybody who said to me that they don't think that there needs to be some structure put into it. I mean, one thing would be great if they had a constitution, because the exact separations of powers, even amongst the executive and legislative branch, forgetting even about the justice side of things, is not clear. And they do need to find a constitution, and they need to form one, and maybe this situation will lead to a constitution being formed. There does need to be some change. There do need to be changes made. The way the judges are elected needs to be looked at. The point was that when you're 64-0 and you're doing stuff that clearly nobody in the middle likes, and in fact most countries that have some skin in the game, that is Europe and US, agree that you shouldn't have a one-sided decision to strike down a law which is so critical, that there's a problem.
So we're going to move on to a question over here.
Sorry.
So I recently read, I'm a recent graduate from Duke University, going to law school next year. I recently read a Wall Street Journal opinion that seemed was completely in support of the overturning the reasonableness clause and categorized a lot of decisions as arbitrary. So would you say that the American right-wing media is right-wing is a strong word for the Wall Street Journal, but still is missing out on something within this, or?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of push, and the Wall Street Journal seems to oscillate. We all know. I mean, it's very hard. One of the things I tell young people now is, who should I trust? And I said, yourself. The first thing, and Ayn Rand says, thinking is our primary thing. You've got to think about stuff. And I understand what they were saying. I think there's a lot of, everyone's trying to throw up their political shtick, right? To decide what's right and what's wrong. there may have been some decisions that were arbitrary. It turned out abortion was perfectly constitutional with Roe v. Wade, but recently it became unconstitutional, right? Is that arbitrary when you can have two diametrically opposed, or it wasn't supported by the Constitution, or whatever? You know, you can have different interpretations, so I get that. The notion that human beings can have, you know, if-then statements in their behavior is kind of silly. So to some extent, decisions are a bit arbitrary. There's no question that the reasonableness and many other things that the Supreme Court in Israel has done are a little bit at the whim of the justices at the time. And you can say it's a legacy and all of this kind of thing. But frankly, so is most of politics and most of the elected officials. It doesn't make it right. The Wall Street Journal article generally said that we, America, shouldn't be interfering in internal stuff. That's fine. We don't have to, you know what? Ayn Rand said, you know what? We don't want to interfere with the internal. We have stopped. We are interfering. We have stopped investing. We, America, at least on the tech side and on the biotech side, which I follow super closely. I can't find a bio and tech investor that will invest in Israel. There's not a single person, and I talk to 30 every month, because that's my business. My tech side, my wife runs a venture firm. None of the co-investors will invest in a company in Israel. 6 months ago, Israel was a great place to go. So there's a lot. We are not this little. It's not this little country in here that's isolated. The decisions they are making are far-reaching for their own people and also for the innovation capital of the world. They need like most things. They need to fix their system. The first thing would be good to write a constitution, in my opinion. But the second thing would be to straighten things out so that there's a law that people could follow on how the Supreme Court should behave. Everyone should sit down and get that done, and they should put a time limit on it. Of course, absolutely.
All right, last question over here for Bobby.
Thank you so much, Michael. I was going to ask you, it's no shocker that the division between the rabbinical people and the rest of Israel is stark, and there's also, of course, the division between the Palestinian people and the Israelis. I'm curious if you could try and weave in, like you drew the nice narrative between the Dagny Taggarts of Israel. Could you speak to where the Palestinians fit in on this divide right now?
Yeah, the vast majority, and this is borne out in a lot of different polls, the vast majority of people that you see polling there want a two-state solution where you cannot have a one-state solution, because then the number of Arabs is just much higher than the number of Israelis. And if you want to keep a Jewish state, which is what we have, one Jewish state in the world, I think we all agree that one is probably okay. It's probably the minimum number if you're going to have a state, right? You just can't bring it all in under one, and it doesn't belong to be under one. So, but most of the people that are protesting want to have a two-state solution. They want to have the Arabs flourish. They're very happy. They're happy with their deal with Jordan and with Egypt. Flights just started over Saudi Arabia. I mean, the people in the middle are the people that love the Abraham Accords, that want to have better relationships. They're doing deals with, Bahrain and UAE and so on. This is where investments coming in from a lot of these countries. So they're actually in a lot of ways considered pro-Palestinian. I'm not making that up. The people that I call the militants are the ones that are living in illegal settlements that are on the edge, that are right next to Palestinian villages, which there's terrorism, used to be mostly, to be honest, the Arabs attacking the Israelis, and now they are equalizing it. They want to have terrorism against the Palestinians, the Arabs over there. So I absolutely support a two-state solution. Almost everybody in that picture supports it. And I will tell you, the people in the IDF, the army, they don't want to be having to police the outposts. They don't want to be there. They don't want to put their kids out there to protect a crazy, quote, direct quote, crazy settler, because they believe that this is Jewish land because 3,000 years ago it was Jewish land. I mean, seriously? So I think the big problem with the two-state, and this is, of course, we could go on for weeks about this, but the simple big problem is, who do you negotiate with?
All right, thank you
Okay,
very much.
thanks a lot.
Big round of